Okay, this is your host, Mark Nichols, and welcome to The Learning Shift in conversation with, and I promise you this is going to be a fascinating conversation, Elizabeth Carr. She is the Assistant Principal for Curriculum, Education, Teaching and Learning here at Avanti Grange, and has been the driving force behind the PRE curriculum, amongst pretty much every other curriculum inside of the school, including my own, essentially the entire Key Stage 3 curriculum for the past 3 years. She's also the reason that this podcast even exists. Now, before we actually jump into the PRE special, Elizabeth, how is it that we've managed to get to this stage where we have a podcast, or at least the prospects of a future podcast?
Well, I think I might have suggested at some point that it would be really great to record some of the conversations that we have about curriculum. And that's one of the things that's been so great about working with you and working here at Avanti Grange. Been the conversations that we have about curriculum, and we talked about how we can scale that up and how we can share our ideas and our thinking about curriculum, keep it fresh, but also share it with new staff joining as our departments grow. And so I think I might have suggested the idea of a podcast at some point, and maybe that's where the seed has
definitely
sprung
did.
from.
I remember it was during a curriculum review for English. We were sat around the table and said, "What's next then, Mark? How are we going to develop this department?" And it was just a seed of an idea. He was like, well, perhaps you should consider doing podcasting. And with these things, sometimes it takes me a bit longer to process. And that seed had embedded. And now we're in this situation where we
giving
have
it a go.
And it's going to be a great podcast for our potential listeners. Now, today, though, we're not talking about the beginnings of this cast. We're talking philosophy, we're talking religion, we are talking ethics. It's a subject that some of you will be teaching for the first time this year. For many, it may feel like a secondary subject, but PRE is also something more, especially at Avanti Grange. It's where our virtues and values come alive, both in lessons and across the culture of our school. So I do thank Elizabeth for joining us and taking part in this podcast today. And I'm going to dive straight into the questions, Elizabeth. So the journey of PRE at Avanti, how did you approach developing this curriculum from scratch, and what were the guiding principles?
Yeah, so designing a PRE curriculum for Avanti Grange from scratch was really quite daunting, but it was also really exciting because, as you kind of alluded to there in your introduction, it's a subject that's really important at an Avanti school. Because the third pillar of the Avanti Way, spiritual insight, is as important to us as the other two. And that's something that sets us aside a little bit from other trusts, I think. Educational excellence, character formation, but also spiritual insight as our three pillars. So when Avanti Grange opened, we were actually the first community secondary school in the trust. And so we needed to create a community school PRE curriculum that was different from the faith-based PRE curriculum that was taught in the two faith secondary schools. As an aside, and maybe we'll come back to this later on, we are now working with colleagues from other schools in the trust to design a PRE curriculum that will be delivered in all of our trust secondary schools using a root and branch model where there's a core curriculum that all students will be entitled to learn, and then there will be additional lessons and units that are locally determined in the community and in the faith schools. But I think that's a topic really for another podcast. If we go back to 3 years ago when I began planning the PRE curriculum for Avanti Grange in 2022, there were a few key things that I really wanted to do. The first was that it was very important to me that we taught PRE that is disciplinary and rigorous, informed by scholarship. And in that, I was really guided by the work of some excellent subject practitioners and leaders in the field, people like Dr. Richard Quay, Nikki McGee, Dawn Cox. So Nikki's Curriculum Inspiration Trust in Norfolk, together with the Norfolk Agreed Syllabus, provided me with a really helpful model of how a disciplinary curriculum can work in PRE and the kinds of inquiry questions that we can use in PRE to bring together the substantive and
so for any
would-be
development subject lead looking to develop a strong, robust PRE curriculum, those resources are out there.
That's right.
How do you go about finding these contacts of yours?
Model. Or? So the power of social media, I have to say, Twitter, edgy Twitter as it was in the good old days. So yeah, in PRE at Avanti Grange, we use 3 or possibly we should really say 4 disciplinary lenses to study religion and worldviews. So theology, philosophy, social sciences and history. And with the students, we tend to treat history as one of the social sciences.
And from year 7, you're teaching them these disciplinary lenses from the offset.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. So history is a distinct discipline, and we do deploy a historical lens in some PRE lessons.
Yeah.
And each of those disciplines asks different kinds of questions about religion and worldviews. And it's something that we explore even in our first lesson in Year 7, is the different kinds of questions that the different disciplines ask. And each discipline uses different sources and methods to answer them. So in designing our curriculum, we've tried to ensure that students repeatedly deploy these different lenses, and so they make progress over the course of 3 years in their understanding of religion and worldviews from each of those disciplinary angles.
I mean, when you talk about these disciplinary angles, even now, and this is, for listeners out there, this is the beauty of working with Elizabeth, the cross-fertilization of ideas here. So even in that conversation, my head goes to English, and I'm thinking disciplinary lenses, we introduce our disciplinary lenses in Year 9 when we start to look at literary theory, critical theory, etc. I now know that there's a golden thread there between PRE and English, and we can bring in those theological lenses when we come to study that romantic unit that I'm so passionate about. The next question, though, in terms of the Avanti Way, just explain what the Avanti Way is and how does PRE embody the Avanti Way? How do you see the virtues associated with the Avanti Way playing out in the PRE classroom?
Yeah, so PRE is both really closely linked to the Avanti Way, and it also has a really carefully judged relationship with it. PRE contributes to all 3 pillars: educational excellence, character formation, and spiritual insight. And I think that PRE has a particular role in contributing to spiritual insight, but with a huge caveat, which bears kind of restating. I don't think we can say this often enough, that we're not teaching students to be spiritual or teaching them what to believe. And the questions that we ask in PRE are about other people's beliefs and worldviews, and they're worth asking in and of themselves, enriching students' understanding of other people and contributing to them realizing their potential. But I think those questions also prompt our students to think about their own beliefs and worldviews. And we do ask them to reflect on these explicitly and deliberately, thinking about their own response to what they've learned and how what they've learned might have deepened their own understanding or shifted their perspective on the world. And it might be that students don't change anything about their own worldview as a result of our PRE curriculum, and that's absolutely fine. But they will change to the extent that what they know and understand about other people's perspectives and worldviews will be something that they didn't know before. And I think that understanding other people differently inevitably changes us a little bit. And I think that's very much in line with the Avanti Way and the idea of empathy and the idea of enriching perspectives.
I mean, I see it day to day when working here, especially not so much with the lower years, but most certainly the Year 9s. You could see it coming through in their discourse. You could hear the language of the PR coming through in the English classroom. I know we're going to talk about golden threads in more detail in a moment, but just very quickly, now let's imagine that I'm a non-specialist, which for all intents and purposes, I'm a non-specialist in many things. I'm teaching PRE next year. What would you give me as as advice? What would be the common pitfalls that I should look out for? How would I approach this subject as a non-specialist?
Yeah, so there's a few things, I think. The first is I used the phrase religion and worldviews earlier on, and I think it's worth just kind of picking up on that. That was a second guiding principle for me in the design of the curriculum. And it's something that's really important for teachers to understand if they're teaching this for the first time. So I read and was influenced by Mark Chater's book, Reforming RE, and there are chapters in there by a number of experts in religious education, and I found many of them really useful. And a really key shift in RE teaching, as I understand it, which has accompanied a move towards a more disciplinary and rigorous approach in the way that we discussed earlier, has been to move away from what's known as the world religions paradigm and the kind of idea of teaching each of the so-called big 6 world religions, perhaps with half a term or a term on each one, and then maybe adding in secular humanism, and moving instead towards a religion and worldviews approach. And what that means is so that the concept of a worldview and the idea that everyone has one, but that individual worldviews overlap with but are not identical with the teachings of organised worldviews, and also that there's diversity even among those organised worldviews. You've got different denominations of Christianity and Islam, different streams of Judaism, huge diversity within Hindu and Buddhist traditions, just a few examples. And that's a really key underlying principle of our curriculum, is that sense of diversity and the idea of worldviews, as opposed to these kind of religions in their silos, if you like, and the kind of focus on the organised and the institutional. And it's also important for teachers teaching PRE for the first time to know that a really key third principle has been to think very carefully about the place of personal knowledge in the curriculum and the role of PRE in relation to spiritual insight, and that PRE at Avanti Grange isn't about learning from religion, learning moral lessons or learning to be a better person. I hope that everything we do in school actually contributes to our students' character formation. And we certainly consider ethical and moral questions. So that is part of what we do, but we don't approach it in a didactic way. Do this or do that. So PRE at Avanti Grange also doesn't teach students to be spiritual. We're not teaching students what to think or believe. So I suppose instead you could say, well, what are we doing? We're teaching them how to think. But that makes it sound as if it's just a lesson in transferable skills, and that's really not the approach we've taken. So it's really important to understand how important, as in other subjects in the humanities and right across the school, is the idea that knowledge is powerful. That in order to think, we need to have knowledge to think about and to think with. And our students are growing up in a world that is religious and in a world where everyone has a worldview, but those worldviews are very diverse. So knowledge of those worldviews and the ability to use that knowledge critically and thoughtfully is really vital for students to understand the world around them, to understand the people they meet, to understand themselves. It's really vital for them to grow as human beings. So the aim of our curriculum...
As you were saying, it's empowering.
That's right.
So the PRE quite often is a subject that could be just sidelined without realising that actually it empowers young people to think more clearly and to make up their own minds about the world.
And so philosophy really underpins our whole curriculum. It's one of our disciplinary lenses, but actually it's the underlying foundation that even when we're approaching topics through other disciplines, such as theology, it's underpinned by philosophy in the sense that everything is up for interrogation and everything is subjected to rational inquiry. And we're always thinking about the epistemological basis of what we're doing and what we're learning. And from that, and from reflecting on their own response to the worldviews and beliefs and ideas and arguments they encounter, I think PRE plays a really important role in students' growing understanding of spirituality and insights into their own spiritual journey. So if you're approaching teaching this subject for the first time as a non-specialist, it's really valuing that subject and understanding the value that it has. And with that, then I think comes a bit of a challenge that, much like teaching any other subject, your knowledge of the subject is really key. Yeah. And I think there's been a misconception that there are no right or wrong answers in RE. It's all just about your opinion, and knowledge can get devalued. And that really undermines the integrity of the subject, and is very far from being the case in our curriculum. So I suppose my first piece of advice is to understand the kind of principles behind the curriculum. My second then would be work on your subject knowledge. And I know that we're all strapped for time, but there are links to articles and podcasts in my schemes of learning, and it's a real work in progress for this year to support that.
Going through that process of teaching, like I've pleaded with you several times for me to teach PRE.
I'd love you to teach it.
I would grow as a spiritual person. I know that I would, because when you teach a subject, you become a master of it. And I think for anyone that is taking on PRE as a second subject, this is an opportunity for you to grow as an individual, to grow as a person with your classes, but you've got to put the legwork in, obviously, to get there.
Absolutely.
Now, what I'm going to do, Elizabeth, if you don't mind, I'm just going to stop the recording now. I think you've already given us some very practical advice for colleagues stepping into PRE classrooms. We are going to do a part 2, and in this part 2, we're going to kind of look at some of the challenges, the bigger challenges, the breakthroughs, as well as looking at those golden threads between PRE and other subjects. So that was part 1 of the PRE special. Come back after the break, if we have breaks. I don't even know if we do that yet, but we will be. It's not the end of the session, but it is the end of this session in conversation with Elizabeth Carr. Okay, welcome back to The Learning Shift. We're in conversation with Elizabeth Carr. Just very quickly, Elizabeth, just to pick up on some of what we were discussing just beforehand. We were talking pitfalls and challenges within teaching PR. Make a quick summary of those pitfalls for us, please.
Yeah, that's right. So we were just talking about the fact that we have a number of teachers teaching PRE for the first time this year, and some of them have other specialisms. And so we're talking about some of the challenges and how we can avoid some of the pitfalls and the misconceptions that maybe come around and RE teaching and the way that RE has been taught in the past or in other schools. So we talked about the pitfall of the misconception that we're teaching students what to believe and how it's really important that we don't think that as teachers, but also important that students realise that that's not the intention of the subject. Our intention is knowledge and understanding and getting that across. Yeah. Absolutely. And then what the role of reflection and personal knowledge development might be. We talked about the challenges of subject knowledge and the importance of knowledge, and that, the misconception that there are no right or wrong answers and it's just about your opinion. And that's not the approach that we take. Linked to that, I think, a second pitfall that goes alongside and that is a challenge if you are teaching coming from another specialism is the danger of overgeneralization, oversimplification and misrepresentation, because religions and worldviews are infinitely diverse, and of course we have to achieve some kind of simplification or generalization about them in the classroom, because we can't look at the infinite variety. But people who consider themselves to be followers of a particular religion often have widely differing beliefs and worldviews in practice. In other words, lived reality is very different from doctrinal and devotional orthodoxy, even before we take account of the diversity of doctrine and practice within different streams or denominations or regional traditions. And so we've got to arrive at some kind of acceptable simplification, but we need to be quite careful not to oversimplify. And one of the things that, as a teacher teaching it for the first time, perhaps coming from another specialism, one key to doing that I've found is the way that we phrase questions. And it does take a bit of practice, but once you get this, it can be really, really helpful. So, for example, we're not thinking, what is God like, or does God exist? We might instead ask, what do different Christians or Hindus or Muslims think God is like? Or where do different Christians find ideas about what God is like?
I mean, there's a podcast in its own right, The Art of Questioning.
The Art of Questioning.
Something that I'm very interested in, as you know, because I think any practitioner, it doesn't matter if you've been teaching for 5 or 15 years or 20 years, you can always develop the way that you question. And with changing times, changing classroom dynamics, changing contexts, there's always room for improvement of how we question.
Yeah,
and it sounds
it's very much not just a generic pedagogy here. We're talking about actually how our questions need to be informed by our understanding of the subject. So we might ask, how have different philosophers argued for or against the existence of God? Which is a different question, isn't it, from does God exist?
With the way that I question, again, I'm going back to, I'm a non-specialist. I'm coming into teaching drama or English or whatever it is that my main subject. Is the way that I question in the PRE classroom going to differ from the way that I question in those settings?
I think the overarching questions, the big questions that we ask, yes, so when we're planning our inquiry question, when we're thinking about our big lesson question, when we're thinking about the concluding question, in terms of the smaller scale questions that you ask on a routine basis, that's not going to be so different, because you're going to be asking them about, what they've read or what they're looking at. And I think those questions are much more similar across different subjects, but we're thinking about those questions that bring together the substantive and the disciplinary. And the two key things here, I think, that we include a subject in the question. So Christians or Jews or philosophers, we're not asking students, does God exist? Do you think God exists? We're saying, do our philosophers try to prove or disprove that or argue for and against God's existence? And the second thing is incorporating diversity, so different Christians, different Hindus, different philosophers, etc.
So I think just moving away from those pitfalls, I'm really keen to get the conversation flowing. I think this is a nice segue as well, because we've just spoken about the non-specialists coming from another subject.
Yes, they're coming from other subjects,
There are countless golden threads. First of all, just explain to our audience what golden threads means. Some will, some won't.
Absolutely. So the concept of a golden thread, it's been a really, really important part of my curriculum planning, is the idea of a thread of connection between two distinct subjects. So where we teach two different subjects at school, English, PRE, history, geography, actually we're studying a world that is in reality interconnected. It's enormously worthwhile because these connections are really powerful. And the reason for that is one of the biggest challenges to the power of the knowledge we teach students is the difficulties they face in transferring that knowledge and using it in different contexts. And I'm sure we've all had experience of that, where students look at you completely blankly, even though you know very well that they've studied it, even in your own subject, in another subject, the difficulty of transferring knowledge knowledge to a different context. And by emphasising those golden threads of connection and explicitly asking students to recall and use knowledge from one subject in another is a way to really challenge that siloing of knowledge and make the knowledge that students have more fertile and more potent.
This is one of the shifts that I personally want to see happen in education for the 21st century. That cross-fertilization of, subjects across the school. Like, I've worked in some schools where it is, you are teaching in a silo. There is your English department, there is your science department, there is your humanities department. And there's very little conversation.
That's right. And there are really good reasons for that, because their subject distinctiveness is really important. And a lot of attempts to do this have failed because they've lost the distinctiveness in the sense of what makes a subject and a discipline distinctive. And then you end up with a lot of information and no actual knowledge. But you've got to be able to preserve what those subjects are and also see their interconnection. So perhaps we should look at some examples.
Yeah, what examples have you got then for PRE that will stand out over the course of the past 3 years?
Yeah. So obviously, coming over the background as a historian, the connections between PRE and history are very, very close. So in history in year 7, we study the Byzantine and Abbasid empires, the Emperor Constantine and Constantinople, and the origins and expansion of Islam as well. And we return to both of those in more detail in year 8 in PRE, when we study the development of Christianity and of Islam and the historical and theological factors that intertwine to underpin their development. So we study in year 8 the actions of Emperor Constantine making Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire and his role in the Council of Nicaea, which decided key points of doctrine about the nature of Jesus. And we study the role of the Prophet Muhammad and the conquest of Arab armies in the 7th century, bringing about the spread of and the schism in Islam. So history and PRE overlap really, really closely. But it's true of other subjects as well. So we talk about English. Mark. So we didn't plan the English and PRE curriculums deliberately, did we at all, to relate to one another? But we've actually discovered plenty of links over the last 3 years. So in English, at the start of year 7, your students study a unit on Greek myths, and they develop a working definition of a myth as a story told to explain natural or supernatural phenomena. And at the beginning of PRE, we study Greek philosophy, and we study Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. So there's a Greek culture link there. But then we come back to that definition of a myth, and we find it enormously useful in PRE when we come to teach about creation stories. And we study what these tell us about the people who told those stories and their conception of what it means to be human. So we compare the Sumerian and Babylonian creation stories to the opening chapters of Genesis. So stories told in the same region of Mesopotamia, but with very different perspectives on what it means to be human. And that working definition of a myth and that understanding of mythology that students have from English underpins their ability to engage meaningfully and analyse the differences between those creation myths.
I'll share just one quick example with you as well. I was marking a set of year 9 essays just after Easter, I think it was, in the summer term. And this was a culmination of their work for year 9. What have they learned in English? A whole unit dedicated to romanticism and the romantic ideals. Then reading some of, and the only reason I knew this is because I taught some of these PRE lessons as cover. And then I could see the language that they were using in their PRE lesson coming through in their essays. And it just blew me away, because this is something, I taught them to write an essay, I've taught them the romantic ideals, but they're taking what they've learned from PRE and they're applying it to their analysis within English. And that for me is invaluable, because I've not taught them to do that. They fought for themselves and they've brought it along to their work. And that allowed them to elevate their grade up, slightly from where they were last year.
No, I think it really shows that the power of the curriculum. And I'm really looking forward to this coming year, because we're beginning our Ethos programme, which is the programme that all students will follow in years 10 and 11, encompassing PE, PRE, PSHE, and yoga and meditation. And within that, the PRE course begins with a topic on the problem of evil. And we're really confident, I was discussing this, planning this with Sophie Flynn the other day, that students are going to be able to draw on examples from the literature they've studied in English, from natural disasters, wars and genocide and so on that they've studied in history and in geography, and use that in their discussion of different worldviews and perspectives on the question of evil. And bringing that all together hopefully will enhance the value and also students' perception of the value of PRE, which is so important.
And just to note that, PRE continues as a subject
That's right.
for all students in Key
That's
Stage
right.
4. And that's
So we've got students opting to do the GCSE, but all students will continue to follow a non-examined ethos programme.
And
that's
that is,
right.
you know, absolutely right as well. Now, I'm just conscious of time, Elizabeth. We've been speaking. It's been a rich conversation for 10 minutes. I reckon we've got time for one more branch of questioning. So I'm going to put it to you. Do you want to talk about like the big breakthroughs through the PRE curriculum? Do you
I think that would be a nice way to end, wouldn't it? And then we can hopefully have another edition and talk about you know, how colleagues might approach, say, the Year 7 curriculum, for example.
Nice one. Okay, so in this case, then we've discussed some of the challenges and the pitfalls. So, what are you most proud of achieving within the curriculum?
We're just talking about GCSE and looking forward and Year 10, so it follows on really nicely because for me, one of the key indicators of the success of what we've achieved with PRE is the uptake for GCSE. Our students only get 2 free options choices. That's not unusual, I think, in schools now, and they have a vast array of subjects to choose from: PE, computer science, art, DT, drama, music, you know, and history and geography as well. But 25% of our founding cohort have opted for PRE as one of their options choices, and to me that is a real indication of the impact that our curriculum has had. And it's certainly higher than in other schools in the area and in community schools. The second thing that I'm proud of, and I think it kind of fits with what you were saying about the role that their knowledge has and how it's coming across in their essays, but it's the positive attitude that our students bring to the lessons and the frequency with which I hear them refer to things that they've studied in PRE outside my classroom, whether that's in conversations over lunch or in other lessons, the way in which they'll, you know, refer to it when making jokes, you know, is this an ethical thing to do, miss? And so on, you know, they'll use it against me whenever they possibly can. Of course, they have their cynical and apathetic moments because they are teenagers, but I'm just so encouraged to find that our students really do seem to see value in what they learn in PRE and that they're willing to rise to the challenges that we pose them in lessons. And, you know, they often complain that my lesson has made their head hurt. And to me, that's such a success. And I know that really they do appreciate it too.
I love walking past your classroom when it's a PRE lesson or history for that matter. But I wander in and I'm always blown away by what it is that we're seeing. We do have time for one more. So is it going to be practical takeaways for staff when they're doing their first lesson, let's say tomorrow?
Linking to what I've just said, I think, you know, how do we get that positive attitude? I do think setting the tone in the first lesson and in every lesson, but particularly at the start, is really key, bearing in mind the pitfalls that we talked about earlier. We tend to start each year with a focus on worldviews because of the way that shapes our whole approach, and a reminder to students of the different disciplinary lenses. And asking the right questions is key, and being able to answer students' questions and setting it up as this open-ended inquiry where we are standing back initially and then bringing the reflection onto ourselves afterwards. And so, you know, if you've got 20 minutes to prepare, use it to strengthen your subject knowledge, because that can only increase the power of your lesson.
When you do that, once you have the confidence of the subject knowledge, you will enjoy teaching the subject. And if you enjoy teaching PRE, then naturally your students will follow. And that's, you know, we had this conversation with another department, English, yesterday. So I'm going to bring it to a close. I just want to kind of just thank you, Elizabeth, for being part of this conversation, but also for inspiring the podcast itself, because it is, you know, a great step into the 21st century for us.
Really exciting.
Yeah, it really is. To everyone listening, whether you're teaching PRE this year or simply reflecting on how virtues can shape your classroom, I hope this episode has given you something concrete to take forward. Now, remember, let's keep this conversation going. Share your reflections on our staff channels, LinkedIn or Blue Sky or Twitter, EduTwitter, whatever it is that you use. This has been the Learning Shift in conversation with Elizabeth Carr. Education is a long journey, but every shift begins with a single conversation, and this was just one of them. Thank you for listening.